All righty. Let me close this door. Well, I want to welcome everybody to a very special event. We're extremely pleased here in the Tampa Green chapter, Green Party chapter, to have a fighter for the working class, for our environment, social justice, and climate justice, Howie Hawkins. And I just want to say a little bit about Howie's background. He went to Dartmouth College and then was in the Marine Corps. And in fact, he was just mentioning to me that he's a member of the American Legion back home in Syracuse, where he's living now. For many years, Howie was a worker for UPS, unloading trucks. And as one who did a little bit of that during the summer, during my college years, that's really being with the workers for sure. Sweaty your brow kind of work, and he's very familiar with that from the inside, having worked 15 years for UPS. And after retiring, he's been focusing on his political career. Back up in New York, he's well known, having run for governor of New York, did very well. Was it the 2010 that you got over 5%?
2014.
2014. But I think the real interesting thing that I would like to stress in this particular political time is the fact that Howie is the one who put together the nuts and bolts of the Green New Deal. Now, as I said in a meeting we had about climate change here in the work here locally the other night, we're happy that the Democrats have plagiarized a good part of our program. It's all for the good, obviously, but Howie's here to talk about the origins of the Green New Deal and his current sense about how that can be applied through his campaign for the president on the Green Party ticket this upcoming 2020 election. So without further ado, I give you Howie Hawkins.
Yeah, they call me the original Green New Dealer because I was the first candidate in the United States to campaign on that theme. Although actually it was European Greens, first in England, 2008, then European-wide, 2009, and then the UN Development Program. Started talking about a global Green New Deal. Remember, this is coming out of the Great Recession, financial collapse. The established parties are making us bail out these big banks, and this was a plan to bail out the people in the planet by investing in clean energy, doing some financial reforms, some progressive taxation, and getting the economy going, getting people back to work. So we brought it back to New York and figured it was a good theme because I was running against now the third term governor in New York, Andrew Cuomo, and Cuomo had an austerity plan. He wanted to not tax the rich. There's a proposal for a millionaire's tax. He wanted to cut funding for education. He wanted to put workers on furlough and freeze hiring of public employees, cut all the services. So we called that Cuomo's austerity plan versus the Hawkins prosperity plan. And that was the Green New Deal. And it was enough to get us a ballot line. It takes 50,000 votes in New York. And then some of the issues we raised really got to the fore in 2014 when the Greens ran me again and we got 5% of the vote. And Governor Cuomo had to respond at that point because he was trying to pile up his vote because he wanted to run for president. He actually got less votes in 2014 than he got in 2010. He had to look and see what we were talking about. We were talking about a ban on fracking. We got that. Paid family leave. We got that. $15 minimum wage. We're getting that at a slower pace than we would have wanted, but the state is committed to that. And then tuition-free higher education at public universities. That we don't have. And Bernie Sanders actually came out and blessed the program that Cuomo did, which is just a scholarship at the end to top it off that only 2% of students in the state could take advantage of in the first year. So that's what they're doing with the Green New Deal now. They are taking the brand and diluting the content. So we're talking about 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and clean energy by 2030, because that's what the climate science says we have to do. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. They extended it to 2050. The AOC marquee non-binding resolution. What do politicians do when you give them 32 years to do something? They do nothing. It's like, not my problem. Wait till we get closer to the deadline. So it's an excuse to do nothing. It's an excuse to make it palatable to the powers that be. Second thing they did was take out of our Green New Deal the demand that we ban fracking and all new fossil fuel infrastructure. You build a gas pipeline and a gas-fired power plant, you hook up residential areas to that gas. The people that invested in that infrastructure want to make money off that and get their investment back over the next 40 or so years. That locks us in to a climate holocaust. Right. Because back in 2010, when we first started calling for a ban on fracking, we were on the cutting edge. Most of the environmental movement was saying gas is the bridge to the renewable future. Replace coal with gas. And we said, well, what about the methane? And we can't afford to put the carbon out anywhere. That bridge is out. That bridge is a cliff. You go over the cliff on that road, we need to go directly to renewables. So that was part of the reason we called for a ban on fracking, when most of the movement was saying it's a bridge, and the other part of the movement was saying, well, let's have a moratorium and study its water impact. And we're saying its climate impact is enough right now to say we don't need it. And the movement came around to our position. In New York, by 2014, I mean, we had a movement that was dogging Cuomo everywhere he went, saying ban fracking. So that's missing from the resolution that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey put into Congress. The other thing that's missing from what we're talking about is they don't take on the military-industrial complex, which is full of waste, fraud, and abuse. It's bloated. We spend a lot more than we need to. I was trained to be a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps, and I learned, one of the first things I learned is it takes a lot less people and weapons to hold territory than to take territory. And we're trying to police the whole world. We have 800 military bases, and we get in fights and actually create more enemies. So we're talking about a global Green New Deal where we help countries clean water, elementary education, preventive health care, and leap over the fossil fuel age right into the solar age as they develop. Let's make friends instead of enemies. Let's be the world's humanitarian superpower and reduce to a non-offensive defense. And I think you can do that for a quarter of what we're spending now. That gives us $750 billion, because we spend about $1 trillion when you look at all the departments, not just defense, but energy and homeland security and some others, and put that money into the Green New Deal. And we need to, because we're squandering our engineers, our technological know-how on building weapons that we don't really want to use. Like, we're in $1 trillion nuclear weapons modernization program now, that we don't ever want to use those. And instead of doing that, we should put it into the clean energy. So this campaign that I've agreed to run on, I was kind of drafted. I didn't really plan on doing this in retirement, but I'm honored and humbled that I've been asked, and I'm going to give it my best. We're really facing 3 life or death issues. The climate crisis, the 2030 deadline, the conservative International Panel on Climate Change. I say conservative because their reports have to be approved by Saudi Arabia, Russia, the Trump administration. And they tend to, understate how fast we're warming and understate how much we got to do to get off this destructive path. I like to rely on scientists like James Hansen, retired now from NASA. He's still at Columbia. Kevin Anderson in the Tyndall Climate Change Research Institute in England. And they were saying back in 2008, we got to get below 350 parts per million carbon equivalents in the atmosphere. And we were already past it, which means not only do we have to stop emitting carbon and other greenhouse gases, we got to draw them out of the atmosphere by converting agriculture to sustainable methods that rebuild soils and get off pesticides, which are also killing off the insects, threatening to collapse ecosystems, therefore agriculture, and then therefore our civilization. And we're facing very existential threats. So, the climate crisis. I mentioned the nuclear arms modernization. $1 trillion over 30 years, started under Obama, continued under Trump. Trump has got us out of the intermediate nuclear forces, treaty. Bush got us out of the anti-ballistic missiles treaty about 16 years ago. START, which is the big one that we did with Gorbachev, that expires next year. Trump says he doesn't care about that. And we're still part of the non-proliferation treaty, whose goal was not just to stop proliferation, but total global disarmament, which our administration has now suffered. So what are we doing with the modernization? Well, the strategic nukes are getting upgraded and maintained, but also tactical nukes. They want to use these in conventional battlefields with the idea that it'll be limited to tactical nukes. And who believes that? Once you start throwing nukes around, it escalates to strategic nukes and you annihilate human civilization. That's the second threat we face. And we need to recommit to nuclear disarmament and make friends around the world instead of enemies. I'm not against defending yourself when you're attacked, but who's going to invade the United States? I mean, Obama said Venezuela was a threat to the national security. Venezuela? I mean, they can barely feed themselves and they got this hyperinflation. They're going to come invade us? I mean, it's ridiculous. And now Trump has escalated with more economic sanctions and a threat of military intervention, although that would be a quagmire, I think. But in any case, that's kind of the madness that we're up against. The third thing is, working people since 1974, our average hourly wage is $1 less than it was then in real terms. People have maintained by borrowing and working extra hours, half-time job in addition to a full-time job or 3 part-time jobs, all kinds of craziness, and it's taking its toll. The life expectancy in the poorest counties are 20 years less than in the more affluent counties, which is an indicator that the working class is living 20 years less than the upscale professionals and upper class people. So inequality kills. And we've had this growing economic inequality, which is reflected in the racial inequality in economic terms, and it has life or death consequences. So these are the issues that this Green New Deal is intended to address. So I like to break it down. The Green New Deal is both an economic Bill of Rights and a green economy reconstruction program. The economic Bill of Rights is what Roosevelt talked about in his last 2 State of the Union addresses. He asked Congress to enact in 1944 and 1945. Among the rights were the right to a job. If you couldn't get a job in the private sector, you could go to the public sector and get a job in public works or public services, like the Works Progress Administration. Those jobs were planned locally. They were 10% funded locally, so they wouldn't be boondoggles, but the feds provided 90% of the funding. And we can make that universal so that when you're unemployed and you can't get a job in the private sector, you go to the employment office instead of the unemployment office. And the communities decided, we need this, that, and the other thing, whether it's taking care of elder people or youth in the park or a preschool program, or we got to redo our sewers or whatever it is. There are jobs there that people can work, meeting what the community has decided they need. So that's the jobs program. If you work, you should be able to pay your bills. Right now, in any year, 40% of Americans have a month where they can't pay the rent, utilities, groceries, medical bills, or student tuition or student loans. 80% over their lifetime have to go on public assistance. So a lot of people are working, but they can't meet the basic bills. So we're calling for a $20 minimum wage. That makes it a living wage. You can pay your bills, and then we should index it to inflation and productivity. Because what was happening until 1974, when the average wage was $1 more than now, is from World War II until that year, as productivity improved, wages improved with it. And since that year, productivity kept improving and wages actually declined a little bit. So that gap, that money's going to the top, and that's the inequality. And of course, concentrated economic power translates into concentrated political power. So if you do polling, there was a famous study a couple years ago, they call it the oligarchy study. They looked at what did the average person, the median income person think about a controversial issue in Congress, and what did the upper class think? And in almost every case, they looked at 1,799 cases, nearly 1,800 cases. The legislation Congress passed is what the elites wanted, not what the people wanted. So the big problem in our politics is that public opinion doesn't translate into public policy. And that's why, one reason we need something besides Democrats and Republicans. So, right to a job, a living wage. Some people can't work. They're too old, too young, they've got a disability, they're sick, maybe temporarily. They're taking care of elder people or young children. They should have an income that keeps them above the poverty line. We can afford that in the society. It's a stabilizer for the economy. And when people aren't real poor, a lot of other social problems don't come up, which in the end costs us more anyway. So we need a guaranteed minimum income. Jobs are income. That was what the civil rights movement was demanding in the March on Washington in 1963 for jobs and freedom. The Freedom Budget, which was a budget for Congress to enact this program of economic rights, and in the Poor People's Campaign. And a big part of that program was housing. The way they put it back then is build 500,000 affordable units a year until slums are cleared. Right now, the rent is too damn high all over the country, particularly on the coast. And we're having more and more people evicted because they can't afford that rent. Housing is scarce. The market has not solved that problem. So we need to build quality public housing. It needs to be mixed income to reduce the segregation, because housing since World War II has increased segregation. It needs to be carbon negative. You can build materials that fix carbon and then they're in the walls and they're not in the atmosphere. And then we can power them with renewable energy. So it can be a jobs program, a clean energy program, a desegregation program, as well as an affordable housing program. Public housing done right, like they do in Europe, mixed income. And in the meantime, we had universal rent control, which is a recent slogan during World War II. Federal rent control. And it's stayed in a few places like San Francisco and New York City, but there are a lot of places that could use it. Oregon just passed that. So that's a program of homes for all. Comprehensive health care for all. That's something we've been talking about since the 30s. National health insurance, what we call single payer. And I'm for that, but I'd really like to see a national health service like they have in Britain or Costa Rica or Cuba, where the doctors work under salary, not for profit or income maximizing providers. And the drug companies, see, the problem is you get an insurance plan and then these income maximizing entities are feeding at the public trough, and you don't have as much cost control. The other thing about National Health Service, as proposed by Congressman Ron Dellums in the 70s through the 90s, Barbara Lee kept it until Obamacare came along. The bill is not in the hopper anymore, but it provided for elected public health boards at the local level, which made the whole system accountable. I'm on Medicare now, and it's pretty good, although it's not universal coverage with no out-of-pocket expenses. I got to pay premium for Part B, and if I want some other coverages, I got to buy supplemental insurance. We're talking about all medically necessary services in this system. But if I got an issue with Medicare, I don't have a local board that's accountable to me that I can talk to. I got to go into the bureaucracy, which Medicare ain't too bad, but it ain't too great either. So more democratic, better cost control with the health service as opposed to health insurance. But if health insurance is all we could get in Congress and I'm president, I'll sign it, because I think that's a basic thing our society ought to provide. A good education. Roosevelt called for a good education. That means public education from pre-K and child care through college, adult education at public institutions. New York City provided that through its city university system from 1848 till 1976. And we're a richer society now, but they don't provide it anymore. That's the kind of thing we need to bring back. And I would add, Roosevelt talked about protecting small farmers and business people from monopoly, and we need to do that. But I think we ought to say the workers should have the right to the full value of their labor. In a capitalist firm, you get a fixed wage, and whatever the surplus is, the profit goes to the owners, even though the workers created that value by their work. In a co-op, a worker co-op, worker gets paid in proportion to the labor they contribute. That they get the full value. And rather than make that mandatory, I think we should have a very aggressive program of developing new worker co-ops, letting retiring owners sell their businesses to their workers, corporations that are corporate criminal recidivists. Maybe we should just say, we're going to take the assets from you and give them to your workers because you haven't been a responsible corporate citizen. In other words, have programs that incentivize and encourage this development. And I think once more and more people see how you get paid better, and the incentives are in those co-ops, the better you do as a worker, the more your co-op makes, and you get your full value of your labor, you're going to make more money. Whereas, like, I worked at UPS, and we get a fixed wage, and of course, we got our supervisors, it's like being in boot camp, shouting at us to work faster. But we work fast or slow, we're getting the same wage. The standard response is we work by the hour, so there's not the incentive there. Whereas in a worker co-op, yeah, the more effective you are working, the more money the co-op makes, the more money you make. So those are all things I think should be part of an economic bill of rights. And of course, the climate issue has come more and more to the fore, and that's the Green Economy Reconstruction Program, the other piece. We want to link economic security and climate protection. Without that link, a lot of people are going to be skittish about making the public investments in the transition, say, from fossil fuels to renewables, particularly, for example, if they're in the building trades. They want to build those pipelines. They know how to do that. They've done it. They resist some of these new energies. And some people think it's going to cost them more. And of course, the right wing says it's going to cost jobs. Actually, this is a huge job creator, and that's just not true. But what we got to do is link the economic justice and climate protection in order to build a political majority so we can get all this stuff done. Now, the Green Economy Reconstruction Program, of course, starts with redoing the energy sector. So we're producing with clean renewables. But you can't do that unless we redesign all the sectors of production. Agriculture needs to be changed because it can draw carbon out of the atmosphere by rebuilding soils. It becomes a carbon sink. And we have other reasons. The pesticide-based agriculture is killing off the insects. You may have seen that report recently. We're losing 2 or 3% of the whole biomass of insects on the planet. And a lot of that's due to pesticide, a lot of that's due to habitat destruction because agriculture simplifies ecosystems and insects can't survive as it spreads. So organic agriculture rebuilds farms that are really, they call them agroecologies. And they enhance the biomass, habitat for insects, which are pollinators, as well as a base of the food pyramid. And we got to move that way for a number of reasons. Manufacturing, we've lost machine tool industry in this country. We don't have it anymore. And if we're going to build solar panels and wind generators, and I'm going to get to this in a minute, a really serious electrified rail transportation system, we got to have machine tools. That's the core of manufacturing that then you can produce machinery that produces intermediate goods and consumer goods. And so what we want to do is rebuild manufacturing that's zero waste and clean, doesn't pollute. And whereas the military industrial complex put a military facility in every congressional district to fortify its political support, we're going to build a green industrial complex. We're going to put a Green New Deal factory in every congressional district and rebuild the Rust Belt, the inner cities, the depressed rural areas of America so that everybody has a stake in this reconstruction. Now, transportation, it's a lot more energy efficient and better for the environment to ship freight on rails between cities than with trucks. And once you get there, you might have electrified trucks making the final transportation from the rail hub or station to the factory or the shop or wherever it's going. So we need to rebuild freight rails, separate lines for high-speed intercity travel, which reduces air travel, and it's actually easier to get on a train and get off in the center of the city than to drive out, park, or get a taxi and park to get to an airport, fly, go through security, all that. This will actually be faster for the intermediate routes. And then, of course, within cities, there should be convenient, affordable, even free mass transit. Cities around the world are starting to do that. And where we've built light rails, everywhere in this country, they make a prediction of how much it'll be used, and it's always overused more than they predict. Because, it's a lot cheaper if you can use transportation, rail, intercity light rails to get to work. It's cheaper to do that and more convenient. You can read your iPhone. You used to read the paper, now you read your iPhone. But whatever, instead of driving and being preoccupied with that. So there are a lot of reasons to do that. So transportation, agriculture, manufacturing, we want a new civilian conservation corps so we can build these carbon sinks out, the natural carbon sinks, reforestation, rebuilding wetlands, rebuilding mangrove, on the coast. All that increases the carbon that we can pull down. And if you look at James Hansen's estimates, basically, if we zero out carbon emissions in 2030, and we've gone over 350, we'll peak, we're over 4, well, last month we were 415, and so we're way over. But if we stop emitting and then start rebuilding these natural sinks, by the year 2100, we'll come back below 350 parts per million, which will enable us to get back below 1 degree rise in temperatures, which by his analysis and his colleagues at NASA, looking at paleoclimatology, in other words, what's happened in the past and how much carbon and what happened to the climate, as well as the models, would get us back into a safe zone where agriculture would survive and therefore civilization and our grandchildren. That's really the task that we face. And that's why we need this whole green economy reconstruction program. Now, people say, oh, that's expensive. Well, the first thing to say about that is it's more expensive not to do it than to do it. Because you destroy ecosystems and agriculture and civilization, that's really costly. And, it's costly in lives as well as standard of living going down. So, we can have more progressive taxes of the rich. We don't have to finance this all with bonds. I prefer to tax the rich up front than to borrow money from them and pay interest to them and to have them get richer. That doesn't mean we can't, get all the money we need, because I'm actually working with a political economist who is a Green New Deal policy expert, has been working on this for over a decade, how to redo all these productive sectors. And we're looking at about $2 trillion a year in public investment, which will leverage a lot of private investment, 23 million new jobs, which is more than we got unemployment in this country, which means labor's always been the bottleneck to make this transition rapidly. And about 6 million of those are in manufacturing. So that's what we're looking at. So how we pay for it is an important question. So progressive taxation on income, estates, and wealth. And we've seen some proposals from Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders with some numbers on that. It's significant. That'll help. The military-industrial complex, peace conversion, convert from weapons of war to green production and energy. Eco-taxes. These are not sufficient in themselves, but they help. A carbon tax, land value taxation has a lot of things going for it in terms of incentivizing productive use of land and making development more compact. One of the things we need to do is restructure our urban landscapes. If we build a rail system, we can build dense, walkable communities around the hubs and spokes of a rail network, rather than this, grid, ever-expanding sprawl, very inefficient in a lot of ways in terms of energy and infrastructure costs. And so that's something we need to do. And as we do that, maybe we take back some of the habitat that's been lost to sprawl. Okay, then when we do have to borrow, there are a number of things we can do. Public banks. North Dakota's had one for a century. It partners with community banks, but they have always made money for the state at lower costs because they don't have to go through Wall Street and pay those fees and commissions. It's totally independent of the Federal Reserve System. So they just extend the credit in partnership with community banks. Community banks, being local people, can make the judgments on credit risks. Chase comes in, they'll give some young person right out of college a template and say, all right, somebody wants a loan for a business, just see how they fit the template. Whereas a community bank that knows who they're dealing with, they know the character of the person comes with the loan. Are they a hard worker? Are they honest? Do they have good relationships with their vendors and customers? And you can make a more subtle credit assessment, avoid risks that might look good on the template, and take risks that wouldn't look good on the template but are a good risk because you know the person borrowing. That's what they do in North Dakota. They finance their farms, their businesses, their homes, their student loans, and the state bank does it at cheaper costs than say, Chase. So that has a lot to speak for it. You can do public development banking, and it's done in a lot of places in the world. We've just been slow to do it in this country. And then if you want to expand the money, there's two things we're looking at. The Green Party National Platform already has sort of a modern greenback proposal. If you remember after World War II, after the Civil War. During the Civil War, partly to pay for the war, they just started issuing U.S. notes. They called them greenbacks. And they're debt-free money. You just basically spend them into the economy. It's not a problem unless the economy is at full capacity and you're inflating the amount of money more than is needed for commerce. Then you might have inflation. And of course, the banks didn't like that because back then they issued their own notes. And, they just basically created credit by putting it right on their books, and then that was paid for by the borrower plus interest. Now we do that at the federal level. The Treasury issues bonds, and the Fed can help with that by buying them on the secondary market. That's called quantitative easing. So there are two options we have, like the Green Platform, nationalize the Fed, have a monetary authority in the Treasury, and they can add money to the economy and spend it on Green New Deal factories or whatever to expand the money supply, and that's money for the program we're talking about. The other thing we can do is borrow, like we did to bail out the banks. This time we bail out the people in the planet, and that would be, sometimes they call it Green QE, Green Quantitative Easing, or People's Quantitative Easing. Those are all options. The point is, money's not a problem. The capitalists in this country have $6 trillion in liquid assets. They're not investing in productive assets. They're basically buying each other's stock and so forth. All that does is rearrange who owns the real wealth we already have and tends to concentrate it. And then there's another 20 to 30 trillion dollars in offshore tax havens that capitalists from around the world, and they only exist because this powerful country with its powerful military all over the world really doesn't care if the Cayman Islands is hiding money that the rich ought to be paying taxes on. And that can be dealt with. We got to do it with other countries. But so the point is, technology is there. The clean technologies are there. We know what to do. There's enough capital, and labor will be the bottleneck. But having full employment is having a labor shortage is a problem that's good for the people who work. So that is basically what we call the Green New Deal. We call it an eco-socialist Green New Deal because we cannot count on Exxon and the Koch brothers taking their fossil fuel profits and reinvesting them in renewables. They'll reinvest them in more oil and gas extraction. So we need to have in the energy sector, a public energy system. Same with the utilities. If they got a coal-fired plant or a gas-fired plant or a pipeline, they want to use that until it wears out. They want to run the nukes that should be shut down until they melt down practically. So we need to have a public energy system that's accountable to us and probably some other sectors to get this thing going. In terms of the public investment, creating these Green New Deal factories, new manufacturing that builds out these clean, green, productive sectors, we did that during World War II. A quarter of manufacturing was run by the federal government, owned by the federal government. It was either a Ford or GM factory that was taken over, or it was a factory the government built. The difference this time is rather than giving them to the super rich and the giant corporations after the war, we want to give them to the workers as worker co-ops. So the wealth is distributed, and then as people work, they get the full value of their labor. So that's sort of the eco-socialist side of it. If we sit around and say, oh, we'll just pass a carbon tax and wait for industry to move, they're going to move too slow. And like the utilities, they'd rather have a dumb grid than a smart grid. They got these big centralized power plants, and they get a simple regulation. They get a certain percentage of what they invested back. That's how the rates are determined. And once they got a plant, they want to milk it till it, can't be milked no more. And that'll delay us. So we've got to have a much more active role for government through democratic structures. So that is the core of the program we're putting out. This has been the signature program of the Green Party for the last 10 years. I ran in New York. By the end of that campaign, we had 62 Greens around the country sign off on a national Green New Deal program in August of 2010. Of course, the Democrats have taken it without credit. They can't get it even passed. When they got in the House, Pelosi won't let them vote on it. Remember, originally it was a select committee for a Green New Deal. They could bring in expert witnesses. They could put legislation directly on the floor. That was the proposal. And Pelosi, after the initial enthusiasm died down and the polls showed everybody was for it and a bunch of politicians said, yeah, Pelosi said, well, you can't put the legislation on the floor. It's going to have to go through the standing committees. And then a couple days later, she said, "And expert witnesses, you don't need to do that." And you know what? We're not going to do that. I'm going to set up this old climate committee I had last time I was speaker. So Markey and AOC came back with a non-binding resolution, just aspirational. And Pelosi's never let it go to the floor for a vote. You know, wily old McConnell said, "Oh, we're going to put all the Democratic presidential candidates, because half the Senate's running for president, on the record." And what did Democrats do? 4 of them voted against it, and the others voted president. And that was because they didn't want to go on record or put their candidates. So they ain't really for a Green New Deal. They're not for Medicare for all. That's why we need a Green Party to put this stuff out there. So the last thing I want to talk about is, okay, it's one thing to have good ideas. It's another thing to reach the voters and convince them that, you know, they should be involved in what we're doing. And to me, that's the most important part of this campaign. You know, I'll be lucky to get much mass media coverage. Probably won't get it till we're on the ballot and maybe the margin of difference in a few states. And then, of course, it's going to be negative, but at least we got a platform, because then we can respond. In the meantime, it's going to be very grassroots. So what we're doing, and we're starting now, much earlier than any Green campaign we've ever had, is getting on the ballot. We have about 20 states where we have ballot lines now. We want to get on every state in the District of Columbia. So we got about 31 petition drives to do. It's about 1.5 million signatures. And that's about $1.5 million, which is cheap, because the Greens have a lot more volunteers than the other parties can expect. But we got to march through the states and do this, and there's some really tough states. Georgia's trying to get a petition get a party petition done. They need 65,000 signatures. They're petitioning now. They got to submit next year. Illinois, Ohio, and Indiana are tough. We've made advances in Texas. Looks like we're back on the ballot there, which saves us an 85,000 signature petition. Oklahoma's easier than it's ever been. There hasn't been a third party on in Oklahoma except one of the billionaires, Perot. So anyway, that's a big thing. So we're going to be doing that starting right now. Second thing we're going to do is qualify early as possible for federal primary matching funds. Now, this is a post-Watergate program where if a candidate gets at least $5,000 in contributions of contributors who contribute $250 or less in 20 states, so that's about $100,000 if you get the minimum in 20 states, then all contributions up to $250 are matched by the federal government until we have our convention next year. So we are right now trying to get 20 states. And I think New York's going to beat Florida. I think that's my home state, but maybe Florida can be the second. And whatever you contribute and we qualify gets doubled, up to $250. We want to do that. That's kind of a benchmark that tells the media that we're serious. I think it gives the Greens encouragement. And the earlier we do that, the better for us. And then with this money, we want to get on the ballot. Let me just say one more thing about ballot access. This country has the most difficult ballot access laws of any electoral democracy in the world, by far. In India, if you want to run for their national parliament, and they're having their big election, was it this weekend? The largest electoral democracy in the world? They call them proposers. You need one citizen to say this person can run. In Germany, if your party is not recognized, you want to run as an independent for the Bundestag, their Congress, 200 signatures. In the UK, the House of Commons, 25 signatures. In Canada, their House of Commons, between 50 and 100 signatures, depending on the riding. Mexico, if your party is not recognized, 200 signatures. Okay, what about this country? North Carolina, 13,000 signatures. Illinois, 15,000 signatures. And that's why we don't have a multi-party system, or one of the reasons why. And it's very deliberate that way. I'll tell you about New Jersey. They have a unique system where you have to get 10% of all the votes cast for the state assembly, there are 80 seats, statewide, to have your party on the ballot for the next election cycle. No party has done that since the socialists in 1908 or so. And what happened there was the socialists got on in 02. So the major parties switched it from 3% to 6%. And then they got on with 6%. So the party switched it to 10%, and that was a bit too much, and no third party's ever been on the ballot since in New Jersey. That's what they've been doing. Party suppression is part of this voter suppression. About half the people don't vote because they're just disgusted. They don't think either party represent them, and they say, I'm not going to play that game. They don't care about me. I'm not going to care about them. Of course, that's part of the game. You don't vote, they don't have to care about you when you get neglected. So we got to overcome that. But so ballot access is really important, and it's a basic fight for democracy. So then, okay, we got our matching funds. We're getting on the ballot. What we want to do next is hire organizers. Greens show up. We're known as activists. You know, an environmental group, a peace group, a community group. They want people out to help them with something. Greens have a pretty good reputation all over the country. We show up. We're the activists. But we don't initiate a whole lot of stuff. We're not trained in organizing, the kind of things a union organizer is trained with, a community organizer is trained with. If you want to broaden the base of the party, which is one of the goals of this campaign, how do you reach in the communities that you issue your call, but they don't show up? And probably they're sitting in their community, think about it black and white. White folks meet, where are all the black folks? And then the black folks meet, why don't the white folks ever help us? And basically the social networks aren't there, the personal relationships aren't there. Organizers know how to, build bridges across that and build a broader movement. What we want to do in the course of this campaign is broaden the base among particularly the groups that don't vote. The working class people, the youth, and the people of color. And if we're going to become a major party, which is our aspiration, that's going to be the core of our base. And as we get that base engaged, other people are going to come to us because then we're going to look more viable than we do. A lot of people like what we say, but then they think, well, you can't win, so I'm going with the lesser evil. And then the lesser evil takes the words, but not the substance. Or they'll, let a Bernie Sanders, run around calling for Medicare for all, but in the end, they really don't want to be the candidate. But he's attracted a lot of progressives where, what they want gets defeated. So those are the kind of things we want to do. And we want to have organized. We also want local candidates. For a national campaign, local candidates doing the door knocking, talking to people for the whole ticket are the local legs of a national campaign, a way for us to reach a lot of people. One of the good things about running candidates, other than the other things we do, whether it's lobbying or demonstrations or petitions, is that you got to go beyond the usual circles. You're serious about running, you're going to knock on doors of people that you normally wouldn't encounter in the other types of activities we do. It's a good way to broaden out our reach and get our message into more sections of the people. So that's what the campaign's about. I think probably what we should do now is hear your comments and questions, and I'll try to give you answers. So I appreciate you setting this meeting up. Thank you.
I was curious, what do you feel about getting rid of the electoral college? I think that would help third and fourth parties.
Absolutely. One of the things, it's on the palm card, and there's a lot of issues in this country that haven't been dealt with, is we've had 2 elections since 2000, 16 years apart, where the candidate with the popular vote didn't become the president because of this electoral college, which is a legacy of the Constitutional Convention and the compromise with the slave owners and so forth. We're for a national popular vote with ranked choice voting, so that you rank your choices in order of preference, and if nobody gets a majority in the first round, last place candidate's eliminated, their ballots are transferred to their second choices. We have about 20 cities in the country doing this now. The state of Maine just did it for the first time in their state elections last year. Ireland does it. Australia does it. Australia, in their House, does it with single-member districts. So they got this is an election just a couple weeks ago. They got 10% of the first choice votes the Greens did, but they only got 1 out of 151 seats. So ranked choice votes takes away the vote splitting or lesser evil problem. But if you're dealing with single-member seats in a legislative body, you're still going to have over-representation of the biggest party and under-representation of the smaller parties. What they do in the Senate is have proportional representation using a ranked choice vote. It's called the single transferable vote. You rank your choices in order of preference. And the votes are transferred. It's more complicated. I can explain it if you want, but I won't, unless you want. And in that case, the Greens got 11% of the first choice votes in all the Senate races, and they got 6 out of 40 seats that were up in this election. So it's closer to the real proportional representation of who supported the Greens. And that brings up another point. There was another election in Europe. Was it last weekend? Where the Greens surged and the far right underperformed. And what the Greens there ran on was the Green New Deal. And I see that as a program, a positive program of hope to deal with the planetary crisis and the social supports people need and the democratic institutions people need. Those are the 3 themes of the Greens against the right. And their program is a negative program of fear based on racism, xenophobia, religious bigotry, fact-free irrationalism, like climate denial, and authoritarianism. And the Green New Deal beat that. That's European, we call it Trumpism here. That's how we beat Trumpism. The Democrats, their main message is we're not Trump. But not Trump is enough. Is not enough. Not Trump is not enough. You got to beat. If you're gonna beat something, you got to beat. If you're gonna beat, how's the phrase? You need something to beat. You can't beat something with nothing. That's what I'm trying to say. That's the phrase I was looking for. Yeah. So we're going to give a positive program and hopefully change the whole political climate. So, long answer to a short question, but yeah.
What makes you different opposed to, I know as a Green Party candidate, what comes with that, but as far as the other opposers like Tulsi and Bernie Sanders when it comes to your campaign, what makes you different from them?
Because we're building an alternative political movement, an alternative party. They're in coalition with the Clintonite corporate Democrats. And if they don't win the nomination, they're going to support that corporate Democrat, like Bernie Sanders supported Hillary Clinton, probably more than she supported herself. He was the one going to Wisconsin and Michigan worried about what's happening. Even her husband said, you need to get up there. And she had the attitude, well, for every white working class voter I lose, I'll get 2 Republican suburban women. Those women voted for Trump, and those workers, they didn't vote for Trump. Most of them stayed home. The next biggest group voted for Stein or Johnson, the Libertarian. And a very small group flipped from Obama to Trump. So, that's just some of the reality you got to realize. They'll tell you on the mass media the white working class is Trump's base. No. The white working class doesn't like either of them. That's the one, so we got to reach out to those folks. So I think that's the difference. We don't have illusions that we can go into another party and get our politics expressed, communicated to the people. I call it political ventriloquism. If we try to influence the Democrats, we're working through some Democratic politician, and he's got corporate money coming at him, and we're trying to get him to say and do what we want. We're better off, we're stronger if we say it ourselves. We do it ourselves. We stand independently. Our message is undiluted. And then they have to, respond to what we're saying. It just moves the whole political discussion our way. And see what happens is, you may have a Tulsi Gabbard or a Bernie Sanders in the primary, but when the general comes and you want to stay relevant in the Democratic Party, you've got to line up behind who won the primary, or they'll exclude you, from any access, whether it's direct Democratic committees or it's groups that support the Democratic Party, like the Progressive Democrats of America. They got to swallow their pride and support the corporate Democrat if they lose the primary. And that logic, basically, that's why we don't have an independent left in this country, a socialist left. Eugene Debs was getting great votes. And as late as 1932, Norman Thomas got 1 million votes for president, as much as Debs ever got. But then what happened in the 30s is the left went into the New Deal coalition, lost its independent voice, and really hasn't come out as a mass movement since. And Roosevelt once told Norman Thomas, hey, Mr. Thomas, we carried out your program. And Thomas said, no, you carried it out on a stretcher. They took a few pieces, but they didn't change the system. And the important thing, I think, when we talk about ecological socialism, is that it's really about power. It's about economic democracy. If wealth is concentrated, that that dominates what happens politically. And I'm not even talking about campaign contributions. I'm talking about they can invest or not. A government, like Mitterrand was a socialist elected in France. They had a whole program, and French capital started fleeing, and he had to back off. Or Dennis Kucinich, who was the boy mayor of Cleveland, right, back in 1976. And his campaign promise was, I won't privatize the municipal power utility. And he kept his promise. And the banks and the suburban utility that wanted him to sell it off said, okay, you won't play ball with us? Your line of credit is cut off. It was a $13 million line of credit. Cleveland's a big city. And you need that line of credit because your property taxes come in bunches. In the meantime, you got to be paying payroll and buying supplies and everything a city does. So you need that line of credit. So when you're flush with cash, you pay down the line, and when you need it, you draw on it. And that forced the city into bankruptcy and Kucinich out of office. And they weren't able to privatize it because we had that high inflation in the late 70s. And Voinovich, a Republican, came in, it wouldn't work financially then. And then in the early 90s, they looked back and said, wait a minute, Kucinich saved consumers of Cleveland about $200 million. Suddenly they wanted him back in politics. So he was a councilman and then a congressman. But you see what I'm saying? That concentrated economic power, that operates outside of elections. And if we don't deal with that, even if Bernie Sanders gets elected president and we get Medicare for all, but the pharmaceutical industry and the medical supply industry and the doctors that make good money by charging that system, they can roll back, or they can do like our Medicare. It doesn't cover all medically necessary services. It covers some. And if you want everything covered, you got to buy supplementary insurance. And it doesn't cover really, Part B, which is doctors. You got to pay. I'm paying $134 a month. So it's not even a public health system. It's not paid for by the general revenues. It's paid for by the beneficiaries in part. So anyway, concentrated economic power. If that stays, then none of our reforms are safe. If it gets in the way of the, people want to make profits.
I got a question. I'm curious about your view of Trump as something qualitatively different than the situation that the Green Party has encountered in prior elections, where you had the two parties, there was all the various corruption, the flim-flammery that you've spoken about. But in your view, do you see Trump as qualitatively more dangerous, essentially a different breed of cat, that should he get reelected, all bets are off? I mean, could he turn into Viktor Orban of Hungary, do things beyond our you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That we couldn't even imagine, because he wouldn't be constrained by the upcoming re-election thing.
I do think he's qualitatively different. Politically, I think 2004 was worse for us. Bush was in the middle of the Iraq War, and the opposition, and we were coming off the Nader thing, where 2000, he was blamed. In fact, the Supreme Court awarded it to Bush. Media went back and counted Florida. You all probably noticed. The lead was buried because the report came out a few weeks after 9/11. And so the Washington Post and so forth, I know St. Petersburg, whatever that paper is, was one of the papers that paid for the count. I don't know how, I haven't really actually ever read their story of it, but I've seen the Washington Post, New York Times. So anyway, I think politically it was tough for them. But I do think, look, Trump is worse because he's the most open racist we've had in president, probably since Woodrow Wilson. He's like the Redeemers who came in, as open white supremacists. He does a little bit of dog whistling, but, the racists know what he's talking about. And that's getting people killed, because the right wing, they're killing Jews, Muslims, blacks, immigrants. And that's just dangerous. And it also, polarizes us in the wrong way, by race instead of by class. So it makes it hard to fight back. And then the constitutional stuff, he was in violation of the Emoluments Clause the minute he became president, because that hotel down the street from the inauguration, he was in violation of it. It was plain. He could have been impeached, the first day Congress met. It could have been the first thing they did. But he's done a lot more. I mean, from witness tampering and, defying subpoenas from Congress, totally in contempt of Congress, issuing orders to violate laws, to DHS with respect to immigration, and on and on and on. Not to mention a 40-year rap sheet. Everything from sexual assault to wage theft, all kinds of corporate crimes, bank fraud, insurance fraud, money laundering. I mean, the guy, only a very rich white man from the dirty real estate industry in New York could be walking around free, like this guy is. So it is like Orban. It's partly corruption and it's partly just authoritarianism and this right-wing neo-fascism in Europe that is, anti-immigrant. And, the atrocities we've seen on the border by our agencies against, separating little children from their mothers is, so I think, yes, it's qualitatively different. So what do we do about it? Well, people are telling us, you can't run because we got to get rid of Trump. I'm saying, no, the Democrats could get rid of Trump right now by opening an impeachment inquiry. And even if we can't get conviction in the Senate, he'd be so politically damaged that he couldn't be reelected. He's already a minority. And if the Democrats can't landslide this guy, who tends to, be between like 42 and 38% approval in the population, they can't do anything anyway. We know how to fight the right better than they do. We don't cow before them. The Democrats have cowed before the Republicans who, if Obama had even thought about doing any of these things that Trump has, he'd have been impeached. And the Democrats, so we got court packing, we got gerrymandering of districts, which affects the redistricting the next round. We got accretion of power to the executive in defiance of what Congress says. All those are the hallmarks of moving toward a more authoritarian system. And so, the Greens, we're not going to compromise, or like Nancy Pelosi. Oh, this makes me so mad. She say we can't do impeachment, it would divide the country. As if Trump isn't dividing the country every time he opens his mouth and incites violence. And there are violent people out there. I'm from Timothy McVeigh country in upstate New York. There are militias out there. I know you got them in the South. They're all over in little different flavor in different parts of the country. But you don't want a president encouraging those people and saying, as he started to say right before the 2016 election, it's a rigged system, and if I lose, there's Second Amendment solutions to that. That's very dangerous. And we've been through that once before. After the Civil War, Reconstruction got overthrown by force and violence. And, it took a century to really start to reverse some of the changes that happened then. So, I think, he's a big danger, and we got to build, I think, like in Europe, the Green New Deal, positive program of hope versus this negative program of fear that we're getting from Trump. That's what'll be Trumpism.
Hi, Howie. I'm Phil Compton. I'm staff of the Sierra Club, and I want to thank Richard Carpenter for letting me be here and bring our propaganda here. I am the Florida lead for the Ready for 100% Clean Energy for All campaign. So our theory of change and what we're working on is getting the climate aspect, at least, of the Green New Deal, in fact, enacted at the local level. So we have 5 states and 11 counties and 125 cities, itty-bitty cities, and big cities like Chicago and Los Angeles, who are now working towards ending their own use of fossil fuel. Now, those commitments that they've made, they do range from 2030 to as late as 2050 for municipal and for the community. So we need to get it done more quickly. And these places like Orlando, where you have a 30-year-old staff person working with the mayor there, their goal is, let's get it done as quickly as possible. But our goal is, our theory of change is, let's demonstrate that this technology works and that we have frontline communities at the forefront, that the planning process, the community engagement process is inclusive, that the needs of Black communities in our state, at least, where that neighborhood floods first. As sea level rise happens and as storms come, those things are taken into account from our racist heritage of how we plan stormwater and where people live. They can go over there. And also to get commitments for 100% electric fleets, as you now have in Chicago and New York and Los Angeles and even Tallahassee. I was just wondering if you're aware of that and how you see that relating to what's happening in Congress. We don't see a Green New Deal in our state with our 2-to-1 Republican legislature being so hostile, doing so many awful things, until we have more cities more cities joining Orlando and St. Petersburg, Sarasota, and the other cities across the state. But that's what we're working on, and succeeding on, with you have fairly reasonable people in charge of cities who go, yes, of course we can adopt this technology and save taxpayers money by making our buildings energy efficient. But how do you see that?
Yeah, I think in a situation where your state politics are what they are, that's what you got to do.
Yeah.
And the thing about the Green New Deal is once you start doing it, it's very positive economically.
Right.
In terms of the number of jobs it creates, and that can persuade a lot of people because there's a lot of anxiety about making the transition. And once people see it, there's nothing better. You can be the most articulate, you can write the best stuff,
Right.
you can do the best 30-second ads, but until it's actually happened, and people can point to it, that's a lot more powerful. So absolutely. And I've been really engaged in this in New York, where we have, New York, if it were a nation, would be the world's 10th or 11th largest economy. We're right there with Canada. We're bigger than Russia. And we're the...
Florida.
Huh?
Not as big as Florida.
Florida's? What would you rank in the world?
Well, we're third biggest state now.
Oh.
We passed New York.
He's talking about the economy.
The economy, okay.
Yeah, I was talking about gross domestic product. If we were a nation in the world, we would be... And Florida, might be right up there with us. I haven't looked at how they might rank in the world ranking. In any case, what we do matters. Financial capital of the world, media capital of the world, big economy. And we've been in this battle, basically Greens versus Democrats. The grassroots anti-fracking movement, our next move was a piece of legislation. We found mid-rank legislators, not the Democratic leadership, who, for various reasons, knew what we were talking about had to be dealt with. Like the guy that represents the part of Queens that flooded with Hurricane Sandy.
Right.
His people, really want something done. And so we got a bill called New York Off Fossil Fuels, 100% clean energy by 2030. We have benchmarks in there like no vehicles sold that aren't emissions free by 2025, no buildings built after 2020 that aren't at least carbon neutral.
Right.
We got 2-year benchmarks, we got climate justice. In our bill, you got to be a resident of a disadvantaged community to be on those climate justice councils. The Democrats' bill is we got climate justice councils, we pick them, they're state officials and representatives of organizations that represent those communities. A lot of times those staffers don't live in the communities. So there's a whole range. I wrote a 5,800-word article on this in Counterpunch 2 Fridays ago, if you want to look at it. And one place you can look at just a comparison of the two bills. And it's really important. I think what New York does, the argument I tried to make is what we do is like the Archimedes lever. The New Deal started in New York. Roosevelt experimented with some of the public employment and public works programs, some of the relief programs. Francis Perkins was doing some of the labor programs. And then they took it nationwide when he became president. And I've always argued the Green New Deal in New York to do the same thing nationally. So I agree. With Trump and the Republican Senate, and actually the Democrats who, what they did last August, right? Bill McKibben, who, started 350.org and was a Sanders delegate, didn't get any of the stuff he wanted in the platform in terms of banning fracking and the real substance stuff, but he did remove the language of all the above. Energy, that was Obama's thing.
Yeah.
And that was a euphemism for fracking the hell out of the country, for the oil in the Bakken Shale and the gas in the Marcellus Shale and all that getting down in Texas and Oklahoma, and subsidizing nuclear power. Plants that should be shut down before they melt down. And a year ago, June, June, Christine Pelosi, the Speaker's daughter, got a resolution through at the end of a DNC meeting that we're not going to take fossil fuel money. And that freaked out the establishment. So the next meeting in August, they said, oh yes we are, we're going to take fossil fuel money. And by the way, we're back to all the above energy policy. So that's another reason why we need the Green Party out here and present the kind of program we need.
And our theory of change in this state, in other instances, as communities are making that official policy of their community and they're showing progress, like St. Petersburg has a plan and they're enacting it now after passing it 2 years ago, that other communities like Tampa, where we have a new mayor who's interested in catching up in sustainability with St. Petersburg, we'll do that. And then the people we send to Tallahassee will have to, and people we send to Washington, and Kathy Castor will find her backbone on this and go, oh, well, this is where we need to go. I just want to tell you, I didn't hear a thing you said today that Sierra Club would support new concepts. So, I think we're on the same page.
Well, one thing I like about Sierra Club is they're one of the nonprofits where you actually elect your boards.
Yes, we do.
So back in 2010, Sierra Club, natural gas was the bridge of the future. We're going to place coal. Yeah, well, but the thing was, we had Greens who were Sierra Club members and brought that, and they had a big fight. And in the end, people said, you're right. Plus, we had some scientists at Cornell that documented that the life cycle of natural gas was as bad as coal when you count the methane and its more greenhouse.
And now we have a major effort to try to stop the local utility from building a new gas plant here on Tampa Bay, as some people know. Yeah.
Well,
we got that. Yeah.
I was a Sierra Club member there was a music teacher that got me into it for the trips in the Sierras. And then I got environmentally, and then David Brower left.
Yeah. So
I left with him to Friends of the Earth, but maybe I should rejoin because, I value what the Sierra Club does for sure.
Yeah. And if anyone hasn't signed our postcard to Mayor Castor over here, ask her to pick Tampa 100% clean energy. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
It's not a policy question. I don't have much volume. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
So excited that you were here and have come to the Tampa Bay area. And when Rich first said Rose Burley had asked him to have you in Tampa, I had all these giant dreams and a festival and a carnival. And I don't want to abandon those dreams. And David and John Sinclair have got a group together from 30 groups that are interested in climate change and climate extinction. And I think part of my question is, I am going to commit myself to planning this for the campus for the fall and have a Green New Deal festival. What would it take to get you to come back at that time with your national campaign?
Well, personally, I'd be happy to come down. I got a cousin that lives sometimes down this way. She's with her son in England who's in the Air Force, but I've been telling her I'm coming down here. So that'll give me a good excuse. Now, I got to persuade people like Andre and the rest of my campaign team, because we got to schedule priorities. But it sounds great to me, and I'd be happy to come back down. And
I would want it to work in with your national thing, like you're coming here and you're over the annual meeting. So I don't want to screw that up. But I just envision this because we had so many non-green friends for David and John at the Climate meeting, and I think all the voices together that we really have effective presence here.
Rose Roby is a great contact here in the state,
Yeah,
so keep in touch with her.
Oh yeah, we know the Pinellas Greens very well. I have another.
The Dividend would have you back on too, I think. Yeah. The 88.5 with
oh,
Rob.
the radio, yeah.
I think they would, definitely welcome you back. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'm competing with the Democrats and Republicans. I got to Greenville, there's Channel 4 NBC. All the candidates, both parties stopped there. I stopped there. They left, they got me on. And so I said, well, who else has been here? And he said, you're the first one. So I got bragging rights on that one. So, we can use that with other media. Yeah.
I just want to follow up a little bit on this thing about the Republican Party. I've been a Green since Obama failed to jail the bankers. That's when I left the Democratic Party. And in the time since 08, since the financial crisis, one of the things that I notice about our party is kind of almost, it seems that this is just my perception, almost a monomaniacal fixation with the Democrats. At the same time that the Republicans basically run America. They run, 30 some odd states where they've got top to bottom. They've got the president, they've got McConnell, And understandably, we have frustration with the Democrats. I guess I'm hoping or advocating with Trump. Here I go to Trump again. But in a sense, you see the obsequiousness of the party. The entire party has gotten in lockstep. So it's not just him. The entire party has abandoned their old, small government, green eye shade stuff, penny pincher stuff. And what I'm thinking is, if we're stuck with a two-party straitjacket, where we're constantly thrust into the spoiler fake narrative thing, at the same time that all we seem to be doing is attacking the Democrats, and deservedly so, the Republicans are, to me, the party that could become the Whig Party. I mean, they could be the party, if our aspiration is to become a major party, which I think we all agree on. In a bourgeois democracy, we're not going to get rid of this system with two parties and the electoral system and all the rest of it overnight. Why not go directly after, in our rhetoric, in our outreach against the Republicans?
I agree with you. I think we need to be more critical of Trump than the Democrats are. That's why I call for impeachment. The Democrats won't fight this guy.
Exactly.
They had, we should be better at fighting them. An example of why we need to be in power instead of the Democrats, you mentioned these crooks that Obama and Geithner and Holder did not, bankers that defrauded people and stole their homes. The predatory lenders, the racist predatory lenders. Under Obama, Black America lost half its wealth. And it was mostly predatory lending. They'd taken the homes that people put all their money into. And two of the biggest of those predatory wolves are now running the Departments of Commerce and Treasury. Wilbur Ross and Steve Mnuchin.
Two crooks.
They should be in jail, but because the Democrats didn't jail them and Trump get in there, now they're running the economy.
Right.
And same thing with the war criminals. Obama said we're not going to look back. Now we got Elliot Abrams and John Bolton back. Abrams is only walking free or, without a more serious criminal record because he got pardoned by William Barr last time he was Attorney General during Iran-Contra, where he saved George Bush the first's ass because Caspar Weinberger was about to spill the beans. So they gave him all pardons, and Lawrence Walsh, a Republican prosecutor, said that was the final step in the cover-up. And now we see a cover-up going on now with the same guy, Barr, and the Democrats are like, we don't want to divide the country. Pelosi. So, yeah, we need to be more direct. And if people want to resist Trump, they should come to us because we know how to resist.
Absolutely, because I think, just to amplify your point, it's demonstrably clear, and you said this earlier, that people are not engaged in the political system because of this flaccid approach of the Democrats, who are clearly, but what I would say, one small thing that I would say, we're not about to replace the Democrats, we want to replace the Republicans. So if there's going to be a two-party system, and that I think gets us out of what I think is another rhetorical trap, which is that they're both the same. Most people that I talk to, and this goes all the way back to when I first got involved in the party, just simply, and if they're politically aware, they just simply don't buy that. As weak as Obamacare is, the Republicans are trying to dismantle the thing. So you have what I think is I would, if it were me, my 2 cents to throw in the hat, is I would more or less make it obvious on its face that the Democrats aren't going to do anything, and just go straight after the Republican Party, who are clearly, at this point, essentially like a fascist formation to me, anyway.
Yeah,
That's just my sense about it.
Their core is a minority. I mean, my family, you mentioned the green eye shades, penny pitching Republicans. Yeah, roots of my family are Indiana farmers, Republicans, actually crossed from Kentucky for the same reason the Lincoln family did, because they didn't have secure land tenure, and they had to go over to Indiana. And so they were like, stay out of stupid foreign wars, watch the money, and otherwise leave us the hell alone. Right. And they were also kind of proud about the civil rights roots, because they were involved in the Free Soil Party before the Republicans. So that was what. Now, none of my family, extended family, all the cousins, everybody is a Republican anymore. When they started running up deficits under Reagan, talking about what goes on in your bedroom, and doing all this religious stuff. I mean, they were Baptists, but they weren't, evangelicals that want to tell other people, how to live. They all left the Republican Party. And I think what you're left with is basically evangelicals who are in it for opportunistic reasons and racists who got psychological problems. That's not a party that can survive in our society going forward. So I love what you said. We want to send the Republicans the way of the Whigs.
Absolutely.
And we're not spoiling the election, we're improving it. Because we're coming up with a positive program to defeat that right-wing craziness.
Exactly, and I think that gets us squarely out of that silly... I tell the Democrats, look, man, we're not trying to replace you. You can be the loyal opposition. You can be like the Tories, okay? But fine.
They are like the Tories. If you went over to England, they're more conservative than the Tories on things like health care.
Right. So,
Obamacare is to the right of National Health Service, and the Tories don't say they're against it, even though they kind of try to nickel and dime it.
Anyhow, so I think you get my drift. Well, I know that you have to get going, probably, Howie.
Yeah, we got to get next event in Atlanta.
Probably.
Yeah, we do.
Anything you want to say?
Yeah,
Before we...
real quick. I have sign-up sheets here, and I would love to have your email address and to keep you up to date with what's going on with the campaign. Howie did talk about the fact that we are trying to get matching funds before the end of the year, and what that's going to take is 20 donations of up to $250 from 20 different states, right? That's achievable. We can do recurring donations. Heck, you could write a big old check right now if you wanted to. But, we'd like to be able to keep informing you of our progress. Florida right now is at about 10% to goal. So, we want to have Florida participate and help us get to those matching funds as soon as we can. So please, I've got sign-up sheets here where you can ask.
I'm just curious, is there other candidates for the Green Party? Or
there are.
Okay, cool. I'm just curious.
Yeah, visit gp.org and there's more information there.
Okay.
So I have sign-up sheets here. If you would please take a moment to just give me your name and your email number. I would love to have your cell phone number if you have it. And we've got a copy of an article from Howie, a recent one, and we've also got the news release of when he announced on Tuesday.
I don't have a camera.
So please.
Take my picture.